The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Welcome back to Virtual Curbside. And a few years ago, I had been to a talk at the National AAP conference about formula. Steve Abrams talked. And I thought, I wish I could find somebody like Steve Abrams to talk to on the podcast, and talked to several people around, and then reached out to Steve himself. And he has been so incredibly generous, and now back on the podcast, catching us up on things that have happened in the last few years. Welcome back, Steve.
Glad to be here.
We want to talk this week about navigating some of the ingredient issues. You alluded to this last week with the whole seed oil thing, and we'll touch on that again. But I think that this is one of the areas where I tell people that looking at formulas is a little bit like going to the store and looking at cold remedies. There are a lot of promises and not a lot of science in some of this stuff. And I think it's very easy to kind of get caught in a quagmire. Before we start, anything you want to disclose?
No disclosure is relevant to this.
Okay. And we actually touched on this a few years ago, but I just want to let you comment on this. Are formulas closer to breast milk than ever, and does that matter?
You know, one of my pet peeves, as you probably know for many years, is the whole term closer to breast milk. Nothing is closer to breast milk. Formulas are formulas and breast milk is breast milk. What we want to do is make formulas be the best formulas they can be. And we always want to recognize that breast milk is preferred, but many families will choose to use formula or need to use formula along the way. My first red flag for any formula advertisement is when they say, this is the closest formula we've ever had or you've ever seen to breast milk. They're making stuff up right from the get-go when they start with that.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the macronutrients then. Let me just touch on a couple of hot topics. Tell me about human milk oligosaccharides. What's the deal with that?
So we know that human milk has a lot of these biologically active substances in them. Some of them are what are called oligosaccharides. And we're really, in the last couple of years, have a tremendous amount of research beginning to show what they do and how they affect the immune function, etc. But yet we also know babies were fed formula for 60 years without any of the oligosaccharides in them, and babies thrived fine. So as they're being introduced into infant formulas, and I want to point out that there are no oligosaccharides that are mandated to be put in infant formulas. They're not part of the current FDA regulatory process. So they might be what you'd call value added. But yet they seem to have important biological benefits, but it's identifiable by lab tests and microbiome testing. But we don't really know much about their clinical benefit yet. That has been much more difficult to show. So overall, would we like to see formulas with bioactive ingredients in them like oligosaccharides? Yeah, I probably think that's a good idea. Is it absolutely necessary? We don't have any evidence for that. And in particular, the formulas that are used in the WIC program, which represents about half of all infant formula in the United States, for the most part do not have oligosaccharides because they raise the cost and therefore they're not within the WIC program. And we don't yet have any strong evidence that they need to be in there. So bottom line, I think that they're good things. I think we're still developing science on them. I think there's virtually no risk to them. And I think families that wish to buy and can afford a formula that has oligosaccharides in them should go ahead and do. The families that can't afford it or choose not to have those formulas or are part of the WIC program don't need to feel like their baby is not getting an adequate formula.
So you don't see this
complicated answer. I wish I could make it simple, but it's not.
Well, I wasn't expecting you to make any of this simple. Just help me understand the complicated a little better. You know, one of the things that comes up, I think, is the debate about, is there something classist then about the formulas that we see offered through WIC? And this is not one where you would say that people are being cheated because they don't have access to them in the WIC.
Yeah, until we have clearer understanding of the benefits of these novel ingredients, it's difficult to make a clear statement. It's not the formula companies that don't want to put them in there. It's the competitive bidding process that, you win a competitive bid by putting out the least expensive bid. And if the formulas became more expensive within the WIC program, as if the government had to pay more, then unless the government increased the amount of money they allot to the WIC program, fewer babies could be in the WIC program. So these are these complicated social trade-offs. I believe that the Operation Stork Speed, to improve formula that we're going to talk about, I believe that there's a good chance that ultimately some decisions will be made that these we call them bioactives, need to be in formula or don't. And if they need to be in formula, then they must be included within the WIC program. And we have to just deal with that in terms of the costs.
That makes a lot of sense. A few years ago, when we talked about protein sources, mostly we talked about there's cow's milk protein and there was soy protein. There are more choices now. Can you help us navigate some of that? Tell me about goat milk protein in formula.
So in the last 4 years, we've now had on the market multiple different formulas that are goat milk protein based, or at least three that are produced outside the United States and one that's coming into the market that's produced in the United States. I'm not sure if it's quite hit the market yet, but it will soon. All of them use goat milk protein. Again, all registered with the FDA or in that final process of getting all available in stores. What I can tell you is that the science is like with oligosaccharides, isn't super clear. But I can tell you anecdotally that many families and many pediatricians like them. They're completely safe. They're a little bit more expensive than the cow milk protein ones, but not terribly. And they are an alternative, and an alternative that many families like. I'd like to see the science develop better. The idea is that goat milk protein is digested a little bit more rapidly, and therefore you may get a little bit less GI type of symptomatology with that. Again, you don't have to do it. Some babies seem to like them better, but they're completely safe and they're pretty widely available. And in some countries, they become a substantial part of the formula market. So I'm neutral on them, but I think that there's certainly no negatives to them. And they're an option for families that wish to try them. What isn't an option is going to the goat farm and getting that fresh goat milk and feeding it to your baby. That's a no-no. Just like raw cow milk, raw goat milk. And we have families come to our NICU, God bless them, and want to bring in raw goat milk. No on that. Raw goat milk is inadequate. I mean, in addition to the fact that it's not pasteurized, it's also inadequate in folate, and all of those things are taken care of in terms of the infant formulas.
One of the other things we talk about is whey casein ratios, and they're sort of all over the map. What should we know about that?
Not a whole lot, actually. Right now, our formulas breast milk, of course, is whey predominant, but a lot of that's because of the oligosaccharides, which are not casein based. I think for the most part, for most of the parents, don't need to worry about that too much. All of our formulas are pretty well tolerated and are mostly whey predominant. There are a couple of formulas out there that have a type of protein called A2. You may see that on the can. You'll also see that in the milk shelf for older kids or adults.
So what is
A2
that?
A2 is a cow milk protein that has one different amino acid than A1, which is the more common one. There's zero good evidence that there's any benefit to that. There's only one small study in infants that's not very compelling at all about that. So it's being advocated. Most of the data is in adults. Even in adults, the data are pretty limited. There's, again, nothing wrong, nothing unsafe about them, but there's not substantial evidence in terms of infants.
And my understanding is A2 cow's milk protein just comes from a particular strain of cows.
It's a cow that produces A2, has that amino acid that produces the A2 milk.
All right. Anything's either happening or on the horizon with plant-based proteins?
There's been a lot of interest out there in non-soy based vegan type of formulas. There's some families that wish that, and I
Yeah.
understand that. Some of these are in testing or partial approval outside the United States. There are none that are fully approved in the United States yet, or registered with the FDA within the United States yet. That may be coming. There's some that are undergoing some testing right now. We don't have anything in the infant market in the United States other than soy that's truly a vegan type of product. But I think it's something that will come. And if it comes in a method by which it's fully registered with the FDA, then it'll be something that we can be comfortable with safely use.
And the advantage of that always is it's much easier to actually do the science on things that you can look at more directly.
Yeah, and again, we know that there is family interest, and I think we certainly have decades and decades of experience with cow milk protein, and even last but some reasonable with goat milk protein and with soy protein. So when we introduce a new protein, pea protein is one of the ones that people are interested in, mixtures, blends of different vegetable type of proteins. I think we need to make sure that are really clear that babies are growing on and have good biochemistries and things like that. So I think we'll need the weight, but it's certainly on the horizon.
Anything changing in the world of partially hydrolyzed and extensively hydrolyzed proteins?
Not a whole lot, other than the fact that we know that these products are probably considerably overused relative to the need. And if you look at the extensive hydrolyzed protein products, and there's multiple ones on the market in the United States, the actual population of infants that probably have a clear biological need through cow milk protein allergies and the like is probably 1 to 2%. That's a reasonable estimate. Yet their marketplace percent is 5 to 10% in the US. And that's a problem because they're expensive. And not to mention the fact they taste awful.
Yeah.
They're really expensive. And so whether or not they're through the WIC program, which means it's being publicly funded, or families have to pay for it, they're very expensive. And there's no doubt that just babies are being switched to all of these types of products much too quickly for symptoms in the first days of life in particular that are simply normal. Baby gets fed 2 ounces of formula at 12 hours of age and does the self-righteous thing and spits it all right back out at the person that gives it to him. It's not a baby that has an allergy to cow milk.
Or is lactose intolerant.
Or is lactose intolerant. I know if you're going to ask me about that separately, but we can talk a little bit about the lactose
Yeah,
issue.
sure.
So the natural carbohydrate in human milk is lactose. Lactose intolerance is essentially unknown in infants. It's a very rare condition in the order of 1 to 10 to 1 to 50,000 that have congenital lactase deficiency or major problems. And yet, believe it or not, it's close to half, depending upon exactly how you calculate it. Reduced lactose formulas are around half of the US marketplace, which is wild. It's just, you have something that has a zero biological benefit that's become half the marketplace. And Europe, you're not even allowed to sell it without a medical indication it's low lactose.
Oh, is that right?
That's correct. And so it's become this amazing thing that we can't figure out where it's come from. So now the question is it problematic? Is it harmful? And the evidence here is mixed. There are several different studies that suggest that there may be some limited concerns. Maybe it's spiking glucose more than we want. Maybe it's associated with increased weight gain in babies that we don't want. Maybe it changes the microbiome. So I think this is, again, evolving science. But what I would tell families and pediatricians is switching to a low lactose or a lactose reduced formula because of spitting, because of colic, things like that, especially in the first couple months of life, is not physiological. And it's unbelievably rarely necessary.
Because you take not only the ones that are simply lactose free, but most of the partially hydrolyzed formulas are also substituted a different.
That's correct, which is not done in Europe either. The partially hydrolyzed formulas in Europe are largely normal lactose or not seriously reduced in lactose. It's a US phenomenon, this low lactose phenomenon, and it's been brought up in a number of different ways. And whether or not we need to make some regulatory steps about it, well, it kind of depends upon if you think it's really harmful. But my concern about it is that people are switching to these types of formulas as a way of treating a condition that doesn't exist or that perhaps needs different pediatric approaches to it, colic, reflux, things of that sort. A switch to lactose formula seen, it's just another hold off instead of actually having the pediatrician help them deal with what's really going on, which may or may not
So,
be anything.
so what I often tell patients, and tell me if you think I'm way off base here, is that I usually recommend going with a standard formula, and that most of the things that you do going to a specialty formula are trade-offs that are compromises more than advances.
That's right. And again, there are some babies who, if you try them on a cow milk formula and the baby's really not dealing well with it, and you want to give a try for a couple of days with a partial hydrolysate or a goat milk formula, I don't have any trouble with that. But if it doesn't work, if it doesn't change anything, then go back because that probably wasn't it. Most of the time, it won't change anything. But what we don't want to see is babies switching from formula to formula until you find the one that somehow magically is a tiny bit different, or you just decide that the heck with it, we're going to put the kid on a full hydrolysate that costs 3 times as much. That doesn't make much sense. So and most babies will do fine with a routine formula, cow milk, lactose containing formula. If you want to give a try, Families want to give a shot at partial hydrolysate because it makes the GI tract move a little faster, goat milk. I don't see any problem with that as long as you realize that it may not make any difference. And if it doesn't make any difference, then you don't need to continue with it. And it's not a hugely big change.
The other part of it is that spending a lot more for a formula doesn't mean that you're doing more for your child necessarily. That you're not cheating your child if you're not buying the Lamborghini formula.
That's right. And sometimes I know the families, especially families that are new to this, will go to the store. And first of all, it's hard to get price transparency because when you go to the actual store, it can be hard to figure out how much a formula is per prepared ounce. You got the powders, you got this size,
Right.
it's very hard to figure that out. But it can be tempting just to buy the most expensive formula you see. Oh my gosh, if it's the most expensive one and has a fancy name attached to it that I won't use because multiple ones do it, or you saw it on a video that this said this is the formula that's the only one I would use for my baby without recognizing the little corner where it says this is a sponsored ad.
Right. Right.
You're spending a lot of money, and I tell people if you have money to burn and you want to do it, but if for those families that don't have money to burn, which is a lot of families that aren't even on WIC, and even those on WIC oftentimes have to buy a small amount of their formulas, don't get caught up into that.
Let's talk about fat sources. You touched on seed oils last week, and just to refresh our memory, that's a controversy that doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of basis yet.
That's right. Every formula that's marketed in the world for infants has seed oils in them. They're used to provide adequate amount of essential fatty acids, especially linoleic acid in them. People say that the FDA mandates, and that's not true. What the FDA mandates are the levels of essential fatty acids that are in formulas, and that's the best way to get them. It's true that when you see formulas now, we're seeing a number of formulas, an increasing number that are what are called whole milk based. So you're seeing it in
Yeah.
advertisements.
Yeah.
When they use whole milk, they can decrease the amount of seed oil they use, but they still use a substantial amount of the essential fatty acids come from seed oil. So if you want a whole milk formula, go ahead and use it, but it's not getting rid of seed oils. Again, it's just like other things we talked about, like goat milk, partial hydrolysate. It's something some families like, and when they do is a whole milk formula, and they're being advertised a lot, but they're not getting rid of the seed oils, nor is there any
Anything
reason to.
anything else we ought to be thinking about lipids?
DHA, I think, is an ARA, the omegas, fatty acid, the long chain PUFAs. It's interesting that when we might have talked a number of years ago, we were seeing the market in evolution. More and more formulas did have DHA
Yeah.
in them, but not all of them. When I looked at the list of the FDA registered formulas that I will give you that list for, virtually everyone has DHA in it. Now, the amount of DHA varies by formula because it's not a mandated nutrient by the FDA as of the present time. It was not in the original infant formula act, they weren't around then. But every formula has them at different levels. I think we're going to see some clarity out of the FDA in the future about the appropriate levels. Some formulas in the United States have levels that are somewhat below the levels used in Europe. It's not clear what the benefits are or not for that. But the good news is that essentially every formula sold in the United States now has DHA in it.
One of the things that gets talked about is nurturing the microbiome. Any comment on probiotics, prebiotics, symbiotics?
So the oligosaccharides that we've talked about a little bit are function as prebiotics. That is, they do change the GI flora and into a healthier flora. That's one of the presumed benefits of them, although they do not give you a human milk biome with that. That's sometimes confused with that a little bit. Probiotics within infant formula is there are some that are out there that have probiotics in them. They're generally a limited piece of the marketplace. There isn't for healthy babies much evidence for a benefit. I know some pediatricians like to prescribe them for babies who have colic in particular. The evidence base is mixed on it. I tell families again that if you want to try it, go for it. But there really isn't strong evidence for routinely using probiotics, whether they're within infant formulas or given separately. If you use probiotics in an infant, it's important to use a high quality brand that the pediatrician has looked into. And again, I won't name brands here because there's several that are good, but you don't want to be going to some store that's just trying to sell you something. Something you're giving to an infant, especially a small infant, really needs to make sure that you've carefully vetted the source of it.
Given that probiotics are typically bacterial. And
They are bacterial. Again, probiotics are present in human milk. There's no question that human milk has life. Human milk is not a sterile product. It has fresh human milk, at least, has probiotics within it. So there's nothing wrong with it. But I think the idea that all babies need probiotics or probiotics are the cure the colic is an overstated kind of an idea.
Any other innovations you see on the horizon?
We're seeing people take a look at the idea of how much iron needs to be in infant formula. Believe it or not, infant formulas in the United States have a huge amount of iron, literally twice what's in the formulas from Europe. There are no low iron formulas that are legally marketed in the United States, believe it or not. That era, for those of us who remember the days of low iron formulas,
Yes,
is
we do.
gone. But it turned out we may have overshot a little bit, and we're looking at the FDA to take a look at European standards and probably try to get us back in line a little bit with what the world is seeing. We're seeing, and I think we may talk about it a little more going forward, issues of organic formulas, clean label, GMO free, things of that sort. Again, these, first of all, they increase the cost, especially organic, will increase the cost of the formula. It does affect certain aspects of the sourcing of some of the nutrients in them. However, formula is a highly processed product. By definition, by the way, formula is ultra processed food because it's processed. It has to be.
Right.
There's little, if any, evidence for any safety benefit from organic formulas. There's some specific nutrient issues that are probably not worth going through in detail. But again, some families really want organic, but I can tell families that don't want to spend the extra 20 to 30% on an organic formula. There's just not the slightest bit of clinical evidence for a benefit.
Well, and if you look carefully at what's involved in something being designated as organic, it's not as clean cut a benefit as you might think.
It's especially not very clean cut for infant formula, which is, as I said, a very processed product where a lot of those things are managed and taken care of separately. There's not much evidence, for example, that organic formulas would have less heavy metals. And even pesticides may not be lower levels kind of thing in organic, although in theory they might be in produce. So the issues a family might choose to get an organic, I don't know, piece of a peach are not the same as in formulas. And the cost is substantial, just like it is for that peach. But in the case of infant formulas, again, and this idea that we're feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm using formula. I feel bad that I have to use formula. Therefore, I have to spend the most amount of money
Right,
and buy
right.
the most expensive one. And organic must be better. You should know that there's not the slightest shred of evidence that organic infant formulas have any benefit over non-organic formulas. But people can choose it. It's their right. There's no
Sure.
harm in it. But families should feel bad who don't want to spend that extra money on an organic labeled formula.
Sure. And a final note then for this week. I get the sense from what you're saying that in many ways it has been a productive dialogue to have imported formulas registered with the FDA so that these standards may come into conversation with what we have done in the past.
Absolutely. The European standards, European formulas are not better. Maybe we can talk about that next time. They are not better. They're not worse than US formulas, but they are different. And they have updated their guidances in some cases more and have more guidance in some cases. It doesn't make them better. But it is part of this discussion that's going on about formula in the United States, looking at the way formulas are produced in Europe and in the United States. It's not like one is obviously better. I've seen people say, oh my gosh, it's better to have an American. Oh no, it's better to have a European. But the standards can be different on things like iron and things like DHA in terms of how they define organic, all those things. And what we need is a global discussion. And the importation of formulas leads the discussion. Where we go wrong is where we make absolute statements that Europe is better than America or stuff like that. That's just not factual.
And I may not be a great scientist, but it does seem to me that the essence of science is the willingness to ask questions and to look in where that takes you.
Absolutely. And for all the challenges that we face with regulatory issues right now, the reopening of discussion of what should be an infant formula, how it's tested, what makes it a safe formula, and why we're getting still contamination and problems like that is a really good discussion. Formula in the United States is safe, but that doesn't mean that something can be safe but not made better.
That's an excellent note to close on. Steve, thanks so much for untangling a lot of things for me and for our listeners. We'll look forward to talking to you again next week. We'll touch on some issues having to do with social media. You've already mentioned a few things, but I want to talk in much greater detail about that. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your expertise. Thanks to our listeners for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The Virtual Curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Thanks to Phil Wirkus, who composed the theme music. See you next time.